Un arquitecto desaparece sin dejar rastro, dejando tras de sí solo puertas cerradas y mentiras susurradas. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos, soy su anfitrión Julián. Dime, ¿desde qué parte del mundo nos acompañas esta noche? Tu presencia hace que cada misterio sea más mágico. Déjanos un comentario. Ahora, empecemos. Bienvenidos a Misterios Clásicos, soy su anfitrión, Lorenzo. Dime, ¿desde qué lugar del mundo nos estás viendo hoy? Tus mensajes siempre alegran este viaje. Comencemos. Ante roses had never bloomed so thickly at Gossington Rise. Mrs. Ban, resplendent in her wide-brimmed sun hat and floral gloves, surveyed her manicured lawn with no small sense of triumph. The garden fate had returned, 3 years since the last, delayed by an unfortunate series of illnesses, funerals, and one mildly scandalous elopement that had given the village of St. Mary Mead much to chew over. But on this dazzling June afternoon, everything shimmered with promise. Gleaming trestle tables, a bunting-fringed marquee, and cakes that looked too symmetrical to be homemade. Miss Marple stood quietly by the hydrangeas, sipping lemonade and watching the comings and goings with a serene, unreadable smile. She never needed to move far to observe. Everything and everyone passed before her eventually. It was the sort of gathering that brought out both the best and worst of village behavior, cheerful facades, barely concealing thinly veiled rivalries. Children ran shrieking past the tea tables. Crustless sandwiches wilted politely in the sun. And the vicar's wife tried unsuccessfully to get Mrs. Edgecombe to buy a raffle ticket, without launching into her usual opinions on outsiders. Changing the parish. Speaking of outsiders, one in particular had generated quite a stir. I do hope Mr. Hugh Trevelyan puts in an appearance, Mrs. Bantry said to Miss Marple, fanning herself with a copy of the church programme. It's really his garden design that made all the difference this year. Such clever use of the eastern slope. Miss Marple inclined her head. He certainly has a gift for structure. I remember him sketching something on the back of a serviette at the Blue Boar just last week. Remarkable spatial memory. Mrs. Bantry chuckled. And not too hard on the eyes either. Even Dolly Simmons said he looked like someone out of one of those French films, and she usually prefers her men with tweed and trout rods. Trevelyan was the subject of a good many conversations that afternoon. A recently arrived landscape architect with a posh accent and impeccable manners, he had set tongues wagging from his first week in the village. Some praised his refinement and taste. Others whispered about his evasiveness. No one quite knew where he came from or why he had taken such an interest in sleepy St. Mary Mead. He rented rooms above the post office, which raised even more eyebrows, since most newcomers of means preferred the Grange or something with a sweeping drive. And yet, as the fete wore on, there was one thing even more surprising than Trevelyan's choice of lodgings. He hadn't arrived. By 4 o'clock, his absence had been noticed by nearly everyone except, it seemed, the organizers, who were too busy orchestrating the cake judging and organizing toddlers for the annual sugar sack race. Miss Marple overheard 3 different theories for his absence in the span of 10 minutes. One suggested a last-minute trip to London. Another, a sulk over the vicar's rejection of his sundial placement. A third whispered darkly about a row heard late at night outside his lodgings. He's probably just being dramatic, opined Kitty Brent, a young widow with striking cheekbones and a sudden interest in landscape architecture. He thrives on attention. Men like that always do. Miss Marple didn't reply. Her gaze, calm and unhurried, had drifted across the lawn to the edge of the rose arbor where Sergeant Cornish off-duty in civilian clothes was speaking earnestly to Constable Riggs. Their tone was low. their expressions not in keeping with the festive atmosphere. Something, clearly, had happened. At precisely 4:30, just as the lemon drizzle cake took first prize and a local girl began an off-key rendition of Rule Britannia, Mrs. Bantry's housemaid appeared, breathless and pale. "Ma'am," she whispered urgently, "there's something the constable says. Better you come. It's Mr. Trevelyan. Good heavens!" Mrs. Bantry blinked in surprise. "What about him?" "They've found his bicycle behind the Mill Lane bridge, and his satchel, but no sign of him. Not a trace." Around them, laughter continued, punctuated by clinks of china and chatter. But the thread had pulled. Miss Marple gently placed her lemonade glass on a stone ledge and folded her gloves into her bag. "I think," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "that Mr. Trevelyan has gone somewhere quite unexpected." She walked slowly toward the rose arbor, where the constable's expression had grown tight with concern. The first tremor of unease, like a distant thunderclap on a summer's day, passed through St. Mary Mead. The fate continued, but something had changed, and Miss Marple, quiet, unassuming, and armed with a mind like a steel trap, was already thinking about the peculiar habits of architects who vanished without a word. The sun had not yet dipped behind the hedgerows when the fate began to unravel. It happened in stages first, a hush near the rose arbor, then a flurry of whispers carried from ear to ear, and finally a ripple of tension that spread across the entire garden like a gust of wind before a storm. What had begun as a cheerful afternoon of jam tarts and crochet demonstrations was now tilting into something else entirely. "He's missing, did you hear? Vanished without a trace. His bicycle was found, and his bag. Just left there." The words gained speed, changing ever so slightly with each retelling. Mr. Hugh Trevelyan, the mysterious architect, had not merely failed to attend the fete. He had, it seemed, disappeared altogether. By 6 o'clock, the villagers of St. Mary Mead had already divided themselves into two camps. The first, mostly the older generation, believed something awful had happened. The second, led by younger, more practical minds, insisted it was all just a misunderstanding. Or perhaps a touch of drama from a man not entirely rooted in village sensibilities. "It's just like that writer who vanished in Brighton," muttered Mr. Petherick, the retired solicitor, as he peered over his teacup at a group forming by the gate. "Probably off on a whim. Men in the arts are prone to wander." "Or he could have had an accident," said Dora Fanshawe, wringing her hands. "The Mill Lane Bridge is dangerous in the rain. Remember what happened to poor Georgina's spaniel." "Yes," said Miss Hartnell crisply, "but spaniels don't carry leather satchels or vanish, leaving behind their spectacles and watch. That was the thing." The constable, young Riggs, who had recently grown a moustache and was rather proud of it, had done a preliminary search after being alerted by a milkman, who noticed the bicycle lying oddly beneath the hedgerow. There was no sign of blood or struggle, but the bicycle was unchained, the satchel open, and the contents blueprints, a sketchbook, and a crumpled envelope addressed to no one strewn across the damp grass. And no sign of the man himself. "It doesn't sit right," muttered Sergeant Cornish, who had been dragged from his day off and was now nursing a tepid cup of tea at the Bantry's back veranda. "A man doesn't simply leave his life lying around." Miss Marple, seated quietly on a wicker chair in the shade, offered no commentary. Instead, she watched the way people grouped together, who sought whom, who avoided eye contact, who seemed to speak a little too loudly or a little too little. She always found people's reactions in the wake of confusion far more illuminating than their reactions in the face of certainty. It was not long before talk turned from concern to theory. "I heard he owed money," muttered one of the ladies from the Women's Guild. "Couldn't afford his rent. Maybe he's gone and skipped town." "Oh, please," replied Kitty Brent, arching a finely shaped brow. "He paid his rent in advance. I happen to know the postmistress quite well, and I heard he was involved with that widow in Much Benham," said another, lowering her voice to an excited hiss. "The one with the scandal last year over the garden wall extension." Speculation became a pastime. Over supper tables, in pub corners, even between spoonfuls of rhubarb crumble, the village turned the mystery of Mr. Trevelyan into its newest, most delightful puzzle. Only Miss Marple, sipping her weak tea and pretending to count stitches in her knitting, remained curiously still. She was not interested in idle gossip. She was interested in silence, the kind of silence that lingered after a name was spoken, or a pause that stretched too long before an answer. These things, she had learned, were often far more telling than all the spoken words in the world. The day after the fete, she walked to the post office under the guise of sending a parcel to her niece. Mrs. Blackwell, the postmistress, was all too eager to chat. "It's left us all feeling a bit cold, Miss Marple," she said, weighing the parcel distractedly. "He was always pleasant, but never settled, you know. Didn't belong." "In what way, dear?" asked Miss Marple gently. "Oh, I don't mean foreign or anything, not like the Weatherby's French cousins. Just, well, no ties. No club membership, never came to church, and always looking over his shoulder, as if waiting for someone to catch him out." Miss Marple thanked her and left. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the Mill Lane Bridge. The bicycle had already been removed, but the grass was still flattened where it had lain. She paused at the embankment, noting the height of the hedges and the way the trees thickened beyond the footpath. It would be easy to hide something or someone out there. Too easy. She stooped, peering at a fragment of paper lodged between a nettle and the roots of a tree. It was part of a sketch, nothing more than a corner, but enough to make her frown. A line here, a curve there, the symbol of an arch or an entrance. She tucked it into her handbag without comment. Back in the village, things were already shifting. Kitty Brent had taken to visiting the vicarage twice a day, always under the pretense of helping with relief baskets. The vicar's wife suspected she was collecting information, or possibly attention. Young Mr. Copley, the solicitor's clerk, had begun walking the longer way home each evening past Trevelyan's lodgings, stopping once or twice to examine the locked gate, though he never tried the bell. Sergeant Cornish was growing restless. A week had passed, and still no sign of the architect. "I'm not saying foul play," he confided to Colonel Melrose, "but I don't like it. Not one bit." Miss Marple, of course, said very little, but, in the quiet of her sitting room, she reviewed everything she had heard. The careless sketch, the empty satchel, the missing man, and, most of all, the fact that no one could quite agree on who Hugh Trevelyan really was. A gentleman, a liar, a romantic, a fugitive. It was the slipperiness of his identity that bothered her most. People, she often said, revealed their true nature not in their grand gestures, but in the small, habitual things, how they fold their napkins, or whether they looked you in the eye when speaking. Mr. Trevelyan had been charming, certainly, but the only thing that had ever seemed consistent about him was his inconsistency. And inconsistencies, Miss Marple knew, had a dreadful way of preceding something very final indeed. On the morning of the 8th day, the door of the police outpost in St. Mary Mead stood ajar, letting in a slant of golden light and the faint scent of honeysuckle from the hedge that crept along the narrow lane behind it. Inside, Sergeant Cornish sat at his desk, leafing through the third iteration of his incident. notes with the weary air of a man no closer to answers than he had been a week ago. Across from him, Constable Riggs jotted dutifully into a lined notebook, although his eyes had begun to glaze with repetition. No sightings, no letters, no financial trail, Cornish muttered, rubbing his temple. The man's evaporated. He's not at the boarding house, not at the bank, didn't take the train. And that sketchbook wasn't his usual one, Riggs added, glancing down. Mrs. Blackwell says he always carried the dark green leather kind. The one they found was tan canvas. Cornish looked up sharply. You didn't mention that before. Didn't seem relevant at the time, sir. Well, it is now. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's chimed 10:30. Just beyond the square, Miss Marple adjusted the lace collar of her jacket and stepped into the small grocer's. It was her third errand that morning, each one placed with strategic patience. In her experience, people said the most interesting things when distracted by turnips. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Ellison, elbow deep in green beans beside her. "It's no accident. That man ruffled feathers." Miss Marple turned with a faint look of surprise. "Ruffled, dear?" Mrs. Ellison lowered her voice, always thrilled to appear in the know. "The designs for that new garden wall behind the vicarage. Said he was going to reshape the community entrance. Whatever that means." The vicar was furious. And don't think Kitty Brent was pleased either. She had her own ideas. There was a meeting. Raised voices. "I'm told." "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured. "So difficult, isn't it, when beauty and practicality quarrel?" "Oh, and that's not the half of it," the grocer chimed in. "There was a gentleman down from London came to see Mr. Trevelyan the Tuesday before he vanished. A right cold fish. Didn't speak to anyone. Took tea in the back and left looking like he'd swallowed a hedgehog. Did he stay long? Not more than an hour. But Mr. Trevelyan didn't leave his rooms all that day afterward." "That's what Mrs. Blackwell said." Miss Marple nodded, selecting a modest head of lettuce. She didn't push. People tended to fill silences better than they answered questions. Back home, she laid her shopping out with careful precision, then sat down to her notes. She did not think of them as formal records. Rather, they were observations, small peculiarities that clung to her memory like burrs. She noted the missing dark green sketchbook, the changed behavior after the London visitor, the raised voices behind the vicarage wall, and the torn fragment she'd found near the mill lane still tucked neatly in the envelope of her sewing basket. Elsewhere in the village, the pace of concern had shifted. Most had returned to their routines, with only an occasional mention of Mr. Trevelyan's name, which now carried the sheen of a minor scandal. After all, how long could one be missing without it being, in some way, self-inflicted? But the police were not quite ready to let it go. Sergeant Cornish made the trip to Much Benham to interview the widow rumoured to have known Trevelyan. Mrs. Lavinia Markham, 40ish, poised, and with an accent polished at a Cheltenham finishing school, welcomed him with lukewarm tea and cold precision. "Yes, Mr. Trevelyan and I were acquainted. He designed my water garden. We had lunch once. Only once. He was charming, but elusive. I got the impression he was running from something, though he would never say what. Did he mention trouble with anyone? No, he rarely spoke of others. He seemed like a man who lived in compartments, one emotion per drawer, and all drawers locked." It was a curious phrasing. Cornish scribbled it down. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Winifred Clement, met her at the door with the usual mild fluster of a woman who considered unexpected callers both delightful and destabilizing. "Oh yes, dear Hugh was helping with the garden wall project," she said, leading Miss Marple into the cool drawing-room where the curtains filtered sunlight like lace. Though I do believe it became over-ambitious. Arches, platforms, a reflective pool. Winifred's Labyrinth, he wanted to call it. The bishop was not amused. Miss Marple smiled gently. Men with vision are rarely restrained by ecclesiastical hierarchy. The vicar himself soon entered, a book still clutched in one hand. Miss Marple, always a pleasure. You're not here to accuse us of conspiracy, I hope. I assure you, Reverend Clement, I consider you quite incapable of such a thing. But I do wonder, did Mr. Trevelyan ever mention anyone he feared? The vicar sat down with a thoughtful hum. Not directly. But I do recall a peculiar thing. We were discussing modern art. He was, of course, defending it, and he said, "When you build something new, Reverend, you're always covering something old. And sometimes, what's old doesn't like being buried." Odd remark, don't you think? Very odd, Miss Marple said softly. As she returned home, she passed Kitty Brent in the lane. The young widow was dressed in pale blue, lips rouged too brightly for mourning. "Oh, Miss Marple," Kitty called. "Have you heard? Sergeant Cornish is bringing in a specialist from county headquarters. Says it's officially suspicious now." That does sound quite serious. I suppose it is. But between you and me, I think he's just embarrassed he hasn't found anything. No note, no body, no proof of anything, really. Miss Marple regarded her with mild interest. "And what do you think happened to Mr. Trevelyan?" Kitty laughed lightly. "Honestly, I think he's watching all this from some hotel in Brighton, having a good chuckle." Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps, or perhaps he's in a place where no one laughs at all." That night, the village square was still, curtains drawn, the sound of an owl carried across the hedgerows, and in her neat little parlour, Miss Marple unfolded the torn sketch once more, and studied the line drawn. At the very edge, it wasn't merely an arch or a door, it was a keystone. And that meant, somewhere in the village, something had been built to conceal something else. She did not yet know what. But she intended to find out. The following morning dawned grey and dull, with a fine mist hanging low over the hedgerows and casting a hush over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were holding its breath. It was the kind of weather that muffled footsteps and encouraged speculation. And on this particular morning, speculation was alive and well. By mid-morning, word had travelled quickly. The county detective had arrived. Detective Inspector Graves was not the kind of man who enjoyed being dispatched to quaint little parishes where bicycles went missing and gardens hid secrets. He was tall, sharp-eyed, with the clipped efficiency of someone who disliked excessive conversation. The villagers, naturally, found him fascinating. They watched from curtained windows and paused longer than necessary over their washing lines as he strode down Church Lane. His coat collar turned up, a leather folder tucked under one arm. Sergeant Cornish met him at the post office, where Mrs. Blackwell, armed with a fresh pot of strong tea and a tray of currant scones, offered both hospitality and unsolicited opinions. "I told young Riggs the same thing, I'll tell you," she said, setting the tray down with emphasis. He was expecting someone that morning. Had the tea laid out and a second cup on the table. And no crumbs on the saucer, so they never stayed long. Graves made a terse note, but asked no further questions. He preferred facts to theories. Outside, Miss Marple happened to pass just as the inspector stepped out. She greeted him with a nod. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, glancing at his notes. "I understand you've taken an interest." "Oh no, not an interest," she said, with a modest smile. "Just a habit of observing people. One sees more than one means to, quite often." Graves gave a faint, polite nod and moved on. But by that afternoon, the inspector had compiled a tidy shortlist for individuals, each with a possible reason to wish Mr. Hugh Trevelyan away. The first was Kitty Brent. It had come to light through whispered conversations and one particularly indelicate remark by Mrs. Ellison that Kitty had been seen walking arm in arm with the architect near the old railway path. Several villagers insisted it was entirely innocent, but others, including Mr. Petherick, hinted at more. Trevelyan had taken an interest, and Kitty, a widow of means, had not objected. Yet, just days before his disappearance, they had a disagreement on the green. It had been witnessed by at least 2 people, Kitty sharped and defiant, gesturing with a rolled-up copy of the parish bulletin. Trevelyan had looked away, tense, hands in his pockets. "Kitty doesn't take rejection lightly," murmured Dora Fanshawe, as she served tea to Miss Hutt, and if he was stringing her along, the second was Mr. Copley, the young clerk at Petherick and Jameson. He had been helping Trevelyan draw up plans for converting the old toll house into an artist's studio. But rumour had it the architect had changed his mind at the last minute and gone with a firm in Eastbourne instead. A small slight, perhaps, but in a village where reputation carried weight, it was enough to bruise pride. Copley, after all, had written letters of reference, and even taken the man to the Solicitors' Club in Much Benham. "I saw him pacing outside Trevelyan's gate 2 nights before he vanished," said Colonel Melrose. "Didn't seem to notice. I was passing, just walked back and forth, like a man chewing over something unpleasant." Then there was Mrs. Blackwell's nephew, Henry, a quiet, mild young man who ran errands and seldom spoke unless addressed. But it had emerged, thanks to the curious efficiency of Winifred Clements, that Henry had once accused Trevelyan of trespassing. The architect had apparently gone exploring near the orchard where Henry kept his beehives. Nothing had come of it, but the confrontation had left a strange tension between them. And bees, Miss Hartnell muttered with disapproval, are not forgiving creatures. Finally, there was Reverend Clement himself. It was perhaps the most surprising name on the list. The vicar, who had welcomed Trevelyan into the planning of the community garden, had later argued with him over the design. The reflective pool meant to represent spiritual stillness was deemed a frivolous indulgence by the bishop. Clement had reportedly been furious that Trevelyan submitted the design without consulting him. "I don't like seeing him on a list like that," Sergeant Cornish said later that evening, glancing over Graves' notes. "He's a good man." "They're all good men," Graves replied flatly, "until they aren't." At the edge of this quiet storm sat Miss Marple, darning a sock as the wind picked up beyond her parlour window. She was not one to leap to conclusions. And if Inspector Graves thought his list was complete, she knew better. A village was like a laced shawl, pull one thread, and an entirely different pattern emerged. That evening, she paid a call to Colonel Melrose, ostensibly to inquire after his rheumatism. They sat in his study, surrounded by books and the comforting smell of old pipe tobacco. "Colonel," she said at last, folding her hands neatly in her lap, "do you remember the drawing-room display at the fete? The floral one with the little paper tags?" "I do. My roses won 2nd place. There was one entry that caught my eye," she said, "a miniature garden, complete with paths and arches by Mr. Trevelyan, of course. But do you recall what was written on the tag?" Melrose frowned. "Something about memory. Where memory sleeps, secrets grow in silence. Strange thing to write on a garden display, wouldn't you say? Poetic, I suppose, or deliberate." Miss Marple sipped her tea. The tag had been removed after the fete. Quietly, discreetly. Someone had not wanted the inspector to read it. She thought again of the torn sketch. the mention of a keystone, and the cryptic remark the vicar had remembered. Covering something old, she murmured to herself, "Indeed." Outside, the mist crept down once more, softening the edges of the hedges and fences, drawing the village into a muffled silence. But Miss Marple heard more in silence than most people heard in a chorus. And something told her that the first suspect was not necessarily the one to fear. Not yet. The fog that rolled over St. Mary Mead that Thursday morning had the peculiar density of damp muslin, clinging to the low stone walls and softening the chimneys into vague silhouettes. It was a weather of secrets, Miss Marple thought as she stirred her tea, a veil of sorts, behind which the truth might still lie half hidden and waiting. She had woken with a persistent thought nudging her mind, something faint yet insistent. There had been a detail, something almost forgotten, mentioned in passing. It returned now with the same curious clarity as a childhood rhyme recalled unexpectedly. It was something Kitty Brent had said, not the widow's bold laugh, or her offhand speculation that Trevelyan had absconded to Brighton. No, it was earlier something from before the fete, said at the sewing circle meeting the week prior. He always asked to sit near the fire, even when the windows were flung open, Kitty had said, threading blue floss into her needle. Odd, that said he felt the cold in his bones. At the time, Miss Marple had thought little of it. But now it stirred a memory, not of words but of scent. Turpentine, the peculiar sharp scent of linseed oil and old timber, carried faintly on Trevelyan's coat the day he stood beside the rose trellis, sketching in that ever-present leather notebook. The smell had struck her as incongruous then, for he claimed to work mostly outdoors, in natural spaces. And yet his clothes had borne the perfume of closed rooms and varnished walls. Miss Marple folded her napkin with care and retrieved the torn paper fragment from her sewing basket. She had not shown it to the police yet. There was something too delicate about it, too personal. The penciled line once thought to be an arch or a window she now saw more clearly. It was a curve above two lines, each carefully notched, not merely architectural, but deliberate in measurement, a vault, a support, a cellar. She stepped out into the mist and made her way, slowly but with purpose. To the post office, Mrs. Blackwell was unpacking tins behind the counter and greeted her, with her usual blend of suspicion and curiosity. "Morning, Miss Marple. Parcel for your niece again." "Not today, dear. Though I wonder Mr. Trevelyan's rooms. Did they have a fireplace?" "Just the one in the front parlour. Never let it much. Said the drought kept it smoking." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "and the floorboards. Were they original?" Mrs. Blackwell frowned. "Goodness, I couldn't say. Never paid them mind. He never asked for repairs. Always kept to himself. Except," she paused. "Yes, well, there was one odd thing. Said he didn't want the cleaner going near the study cupboard. Said it contained old tax papers and blueprints. But Agnes told me she once opened it by mistake and it didn't have a single paper inside, just a bundle of string and a torch." "A torch?" "Yes, one of those long, electric things with heavy ends. Bit odd, I thought." Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes the smallest things are the most telling. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage once again, this time with a plum tart in hand. The vicar's wife, ever the grateful hostess, ushered her in. "I was wondering," Miss Marple said after tea had been served, "if you might allow me to have a look at the plans Mr. Trevelyan drew up for the community garden. I understand they were submitted to the committee." Winifred Clement hesitated only slightly. "Of course, we still have them in the study." Moments later, Miss Marple sat with the plans spread before her. She studied each line of curve, measurement, and annotation, There, along the lower edge of the main sketch, was a faint marking, almost imperceptibly. Substratum access, it read, with an arrow pointing beyond the central reflecting pool. Miss Marple traced the line with her finger, frowning. "Did Mr. Trevelyan ever discuss anything beneath the garden?" she asked softly. "The old water channels, I suppose," said Mrs. Clement. "The vicar once mentioned there had been a Roman well or something of that sort on the land, years ago, but it was filled in long before the parish hall was built." "Curious," Miss Marple said. "He seemed very interested in what lay beneath." She thanked the vicar's wife and took her leave, walking slowly through the green as the fog began to lift, replaced by the pale golden light of early evening. The sound of children playing echoed faintly from behind the hedges, and the clink of teacups floated out from open kitchen windows. On the edge of the green, she passed Mr. Copley. He tipped his hat, hesitated, then spoke. "You've been asking about Mr. Trevelyan?" "Only listening, Mr. Copley." "It's what I do." I should tell someone," he said, glancing nervously about. "I was at his lodgings the morning he disappeared. Not long, just he had a letter for me to sign. Something to do with an appointment with an estate agent, but when I arrived, he wasn't there. The door was unlocked, his coat was gone, but there was this smell." Miss Marple waited, like damp earth, like a cellar, but I couldn't see anything out of place, just the cupboard door swinging slightly ajar. "Did you close it?" He shook his head. "Didn't touch a thing. I left after 5 minutes. I thought he might be walking in the village. But I never saw him again." Miss Marple thanked him kindly and walked on. That evening, she sat in her parlor, knitting untouched in her lap, as she stared into the fire. A torch in an empty cupboard, a cellar beneath a garden. A faint smell of damp earth in a room where no cellar should be, and a missing green notebook. It was not conclusive. Not yet. But something buried wanted to be found. And it was no longer content to stay hidden. Miss Marple looked at the mantel clock. It was time to ask Sergeant Cornish a question he might not be ready to hear. Not yet, but soon. Rain had begun to fall by morning, not in sheets, but in soft, drizzling patterns that clung to the stonework and left a sheen upon the pavements. It made St. Mary Mead quieter than usual, the village wrapped in a hush of damp hedges and umbrellas, with worn handles. The weather, Miss Marple thought, was entirely appropriate. Drizzles seemed to bring out what lay beneath, to soften the skin of daily life until what was hidden might finally show through. She was up early, polishing her spectacles with care and selecting a rain hat with a slightly firmer brim. She had no intention of playing detective in the grand sense. It was not her style. But certain conversations had been left incomplete, and it was time they were seen through. Her first visit was to the vicarage, not to see the Reverend Clement this time, but his wife. Winifred opened the door with her usual composed smile, though her eyes were shadowed with fatigue. "Miss Marple, come in, do. I'm afraid the house is in slight disarray. Had a leak in the scullery." "I won't trouble you long, dear," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. "I've only come to ask a question. About the day of the fete." "The fete?" Winifred paused. "I'm afraid it's all a blur now." "What about it? Did you see Mr. Trevelyan at all that morning?" Winifred blinked. "Why, yes. He came by the churchyard around 9:30. I was arranging flowers inside the nave, and he said something about needing to check the garden perimeter one final time. He had his satchel with him, and seemed distracted." "Distracted in what way?" "He looked behind him twice while walking away, as though he expected someone to follow." Miss Marple pressed gently. "And was there anyone else in the churchyard?" The vicar's wife hesitated. "Kitty Brent. She'd come early to help arrange the bunting for the side stalls, but when I called her, she didn't answer right away. I found her near the old vestry steps, just standing there, watching. Watching whom? Winifred glanced away. Mr. Trevelyan, I suppose. Miss Marple thanked her and took her leave, walking slowly in the direction of the green. The rain had eased to a misty curtain, fine as lace. By the time she reached the edge of the post office garden, she caught sight of Kitty Brent herself. The widow stood beneath a dripping rose arbor, umbrella tilted jauntily, a pale blue scarf framing her face like a porcelain cameo. Her expression was guarded as Miss Marple approached. Miss Marple, I imagine you've come with questions. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not questions, just thoughts. Sometimes it helps to share them. Kitty glanced toward the wet gravel path. There's not much to share. You were close to Mr. Trevelyan. I suppose I was. And yet he never mentioned where he truly came from, did he? Kitty turned then, sharply. What do you mean? He told some he trained in Paris, others in Sussex, claimed to have worked in Rome and Cornwall within the same decade. A man with so many pasts rarely has one future. Kitty's mouth tightened. Is that supposed to mean something? Miss Marple's tone remained calm. Only that it must be very tiring, keeping someone's secrets. Especially when those secrets begin to turn against you. There was a pause, long and brittle. Kitty looked away. He said he was starting fresh, that he had made mistakes. I didn't press. You confronted him the day before the fete, Miss Marple said gently. Kitty's voice turned brittle. Because I found the photograph, folded in one of his books. A woman, much younger, and a child. He wouldn't say, said it didn't matter any more. But his eyes said otherwise. He looked like someone standing over something that wouldn't stay buried. Miss Marple nodded, her voice quiet. And did he tell you what was hidden beneath the garden? Kitty stiffened. What garden? The one behind the parish hall, the one he insisted be regraded, with that peculiar note in the plan's substratum access. It was a riddle, Miss Brent. Not of design, of concealment. Kitty's eyes flashed. If he hid something, it wasn't for me. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said. But you may have been the last person to know he meant to unearth it. Kitty's expression faltered then. He said he was going to make things right. That was the last thing he said to me. Which, depending on what was being hidden, might have been a very dangerous thing indeed. Kitty said nothing more. And Miss Marple, seeing no gain in pressing, simply nodded and turned back, toward the lane. Her next stop was the Blackwell residence, where Henry, the quiet nephew, was in the midst of moving crates of jam preserves. He looked up as she approached, blinking against the drizzle. Miss Marple, I wonder, she said lightly, if you might show me the garden shed. Henry frowned. The shed? Only a quick peek. I understand Mr. had shown interest in it. Curious, don't you think? He hesitated, but opened the gate. The shed was modest stone-walled, with a sloping roof and a scent of old tools. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn at once to a patch of disturbed earth, near the back corner, slightly sunken, recently turned. Have you been digging, Henry? He looked flustered. Only for the drainage pipe. We had some flooding last month. She said nothing. Instead, she bent, brushed away a few leaves, and uncovered something hard. A handle, metallic, flat, painted once, now chipped. She straightened, slowly. This wasn't part of the drain, was it? Henry swallowed. I don't know. I didn't put it there. Did you tell anyone it was here? He shook his head. Miss Marple brushed her gloves. Best you don't move it again. I imagine Inspector Graves will want a look. As she left, the clouds above shifted, and a narrow band of light broke through. slanting across the thatched rooftops like a searchbeam. Secrets, she knew, had a way of rising, even in damp soil. That evening, as she returned to her parlour and lit the fire, Miss Marple reflected on the faces she'd seen that day, the tension behind Winnie's smile, the tightness in Kitty's voice, the quick flicker of fear in Henry's eyes. The village was closing ranks. Something was cracking beneath the surface, and the clue, half buried and rusting, was beginning to shine. The rain had passed by morning, leaving behind a sky the colour of old china and roads still glistening with puddles that mirrored the slate roofs above. It was one of those deceptive English days that pretended at calm while something invisible gathered at the edges. At the breakfast table, Miss Marple took only one slice of toast, unusually quiet as she buttered it with methodical care. Her eyes, however, betrayed movement, busy behind the spectacles, sifting, comparing, knitting together the disparate strands. Now emerging from beneath the polite veneer of St. Mary Mead, the discovery in the shed weighed heavily on her mind. The flat, chipped metal handle, concealed beneath freshly turned soil, was not just out of place, it had no reason to be there at all. Miss Marple had examined enough sheds in her time to know the difference between useful rust and buried intention. What tool belonged there? None she knew of. What did it open? That, of course, was the question. By 10 o'clock, news of the discovery had already spread, and Inspector Graves had returned from the county headquarters with a broader team and a sour disposition. No further delays, he told Sergeant Cornish, his tone clipped. We search the outbuildings properly, speak to every resident who had contact with Trevelyan, and if necessary, bring in dogs. Sergeant Cornish, for his part, looked worn but increasingly uneasy. Dogs, sir? Graves nodded. The scent may still be traceable if something or someone was moved. Miss Marple observed all this from the edge of the green, seated on her usual bench with a paper-wrapped parcel in her lap that she had no intention of mailing. She did not yet believe there would be a need for dogs. Not yet, because she had come to believe something very particular. Mr. Hugh Trevelyan had not simply vanished. He had been silenced, and somewhere in this village was the person who knew why. By mid-afternoon, the unexpected happened. A discovery. It came from young Constable Riggs, who had taken it upon himself to search the vicarage grounds, particularly the area near the planned reflecting pool. According to the old plans submitted by Trevelyan, that space had once included something labelled archway, foundation, non-structural, and Riggs, who prided himself on taking initiative, decided to dig. What he unearthed was not structural, certainly, but it was significant. Just beneath the soft turf, surrounded by a nest of old brick and stone, lay a cloth-wrapped bundle. Within it, a set of folded documents, yellowed by age, and a broken photograph frame. The papers were drawings, not unlike those Trevelyan had been seen sketching in the days before his disappearance. But these were different, older, far more detailed. There were notes written in the margins, dates stretching back 15 years, and signatures not in Trevelyan's hand. One name appeared repeatedly, Lawrence Bexley. The name, when read aloud by Inspector Graves, sent a ripple through the group gathered near the garden. Lawrence Bexley had been a local architect, now deceased, presumed drowned in an accident off the Cornish coast a decade ago. But what had never been publicly known was the quiet suspicion that followed his death. Rumors of fraud, of unpaid debts, of a failed project that left several investors ruined. Trevelyan, it seemed, had been in possession of Bexley's old plans. Why hide them here? Graves asked, aloud, frowning. And why bring them up now? Miss Marple, standing just behind the circle of uniformed men, offered a mild suggestion. "Perhaps because Mr. Trevelyan wasn't hiding them," she said softly. "Perhaps he intended to reveal them, and someone else couldn't allow that." Graves turned to her, lips pressed thin. "You believe this is connected?" "I believe," she replied, "that someone in this village recognized those plans, and was afraid of what they represented." The photograph frame, shattered along the edges, revealed further curiosity. Though the photo itself was missing, the backing paper had an inscription. "To Hume the past remained buried." And beneath it, in faint pencil, "E.S." It meant little to the police at first, but to Miss Marple it struck like a chime in a silent room. That evening, in her parlour, she took down an old village newsletter. The edition from 1949, listing the committee members for the Historical Society's reconstruction of the Toll House. Among the names, Edith Sutherland, a widow, lived on the far edge of the village, rarely seen, though still addressed with the clipped formality reserved for those once of higher standing. Her husband, long gone, had been a solicitor. She had a son, Evan, who left for Canada and never returned. But more importantly, she had been involved in the planning of that very same toll house that Mr. Trevelyan had expressed interest in restoring. Miss Marple knew what she had to do. The next morning, just after sunrise, she walked the long path past the dewdamp hedgerows to the ivy-covered cottage where Edith Sutherland now lived in seclusion. The garden was overgrown, the curtains drawn, but smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Mrs. Sutherland answered the door herself. She was older than Miss Marple, remembered thin, but sharp-eyed, her hair gathered into a soft twist of silver. "Yes, I was wondering," Miss Marple said kindly, "if you had any recollection of Mr. Lawrence Bexley." Edith's expression faltered for the briefest second. "That was a long time ago. Some of his papers were discovered yesterday," Miss Marple continued, "buried near the parish hall garden. You knew him, didn't you?" There was a pause, then, softly, "He was my cousin. Few knew, it was simpler, back then, to keep it quiet. And, Mr. Trevelyan," Edith hesitated. "He contacted me months ago. Said he'd found something of Lawrence's among the old blueprints sold at auction. He came to see me, asked questions." "What kind of questions?" "About the toll house, about a trust fund Lawrence once handled. I told him to leave it alone, but he was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant ruining someone else's peace." Edith's gaze darkened. "Some things are best left to rot, Miss Marple." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "But they rarely do," she said. "They tend to rise, especially when someone tries too hard to keep them buried." As she walked back through the morning mist, Miss Marple knew this. Someone had feared what Mr. Trevelyan would reveal, fearing the truth held in those yellowed pages and a past long thought erased, and that fear, she now suspected, had led to something far darker, something deadly. The past was not just returning to St. Mary Mead, it had never truly left. It was not Miss Marple's habit to confront anyone directly. She had found, over the years, that truth was rarely revealed through pressure. Rather, it was coaxed out like a shy cat beneath a porch, or a memory softened by time. People, when allowed to speak freely, often told you everything you needed to know, especially when they thought you were too old, too delicate, or too harmless to truly understand. But there were moments, rare and specific, when a nudge, just the right one, in just the right place, could bring about revelation. She sat that evening in her drawing-room with her knitting basket beside her, though the needles barely moved. Her eyes, instead, were fixed on the torn paper that had started it all, the scrap from the Mill Lane path, part of a drawing, the faintest trace of a keystone. A keystone for what? She now believed she knew. It was time to watch someone closely, to see whether guilt could hide itself from someone who, seemingly, was only passing the sugar, at precisely 4:05. She made her way to Mrs. Bantry's. It was an ideal setting. Tea in the sunroom, light conversation, and a guest list carefully curated under Miss Marple's subtle suggestion. "I thought it might lift the mood," Mrs. Bantry had said cheerfully that morning. "Poor village has been rather on edge, don't you think?" The tea was arranged with her usual elegance. Cucumber sandwiches without crusts, fruitcake studded with glaced cherries, and a fine, silver teapot that steamed politely between guests. Miss Marple arrived just after Kitty Brent, who was in pale lavender today, and just before Mr. Copley, who had the distracted look of a man with too many unfinished letters in his drawer. Mrs. Clement was there too, as was Henry Blackwell, quiet, polite, uncomfortable in anything more social than a grocer's counter. It was, in truth, not a large gathering, but it was enough. The conversation started innocuously, as it always did. Mrs. Bantry inquired after roses. Kitty recounted a story about her missing brooch, likely not missing at all, and Mr. Copley gave a short and self-conscious commentary on the latest parish bulletin. Miss Marple sat quietly through it all, gently smiling, gently observing. Then she set her trap. "So odd," she said, almost dreamily, "how people tend to return to the scene, isn't it?" Kitty blinked. "What scene?" "Oh, anything. Dramatic. A mislaid brooch, a garden gone awry, even an old grudge. It's the nature of memory. It pulls us back, over and over." "Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement said with a smile, "you do sound terribly ominous." Miss Marple laughed, softly. "Oh, I don't mean to, only it struck me just this morning how much has been forgotten about the old toll house." There it was. She saw it clearly, the flinch. Not in Kitty, nor in Mr. Copley, who was now buttering a scone with great attention, but in Henry, a tiny, involuntary shift, the tightening of the jaw, the lowering of the eyes. "Do you know," she continued, "they say it was once used to store documents during the war. Secret messages, even. Quite exciting. I wonder what remains beneath it now. One does so often forget what lies under the surface." Henry's teacup clicked slightly against the saucer. "Do you know, Miss Marple," he said, not looking up, "it's rather improper to speculate about things like that. Causes trouble. Rumors. Oh, I've always found that trouble tends to bloom where silence has settled longest." She reached for a biscuit. "Take Mr. Trevelyan, for example. He was terribly interested in that toll house. Said he wanted to reveal something. Perhaps he meant more than the architecture. Perhaps he just wanted to leave," said Kitty abruptly. "Perhaps he found this place too small." "That may be," Miss Marple said mildly, "but then again, people don't usually leave behind satchels, do they? Or torn blueprints. Or things that others might not wish found." The room was quiet. Mrs. Bantry, sensing something in the air, rose to refresh the teapot. Mr. Copley excused himself to answer a knock at the back door. Only Henry remained seated, staring into his cup. Miss Marple turned to him. "Dear Henry, may I ask you something curious?" He didn't look up. "Yes. Did you ever meet Lawrence Bexley?" At that, he did look up, his eyes wide. "What? No, no, of course not," she said gently. "But I understand your mother worked in his office, briefly, years ago, before she moved here." Henry's mouth moved slightly. "That was a long time ago." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Long enough that people forget who saw what. Long enough that buried secrets feel safe again." She let the silence hold, then leaned back in her chair. "Would you be a dear and fetch another spoon? I believe Mrs. Clements lost hers to her saucer again." He stood a bit too quickly, knocked his napkin from his lap, and fumbled slightly as he crossed the rug. The tension in his spine was clear. The spoon was found, the teacup replaced, but Miss Marple had seen what she needed to see. Later that evening, in her parlour once more, she met with Sergeant Cornish and Inspector Graves. "I don't yet have proof," she said calmly, "but I believe Mr. Trevelyan had uncovered evidence of embezzlement, possibly something connected to the Restoration Fund for the toll house, something that linked back not just to Lawrence Bexley, but to someone still here, someone who benefited from keeping it quiet." Graves frowned. "That's quite a claim." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then allow me to suggest something simpler." She pulled the Thorn drawing from her basket and laid it on the table. "This keystone here, it's not just symbolic. It marks an access point. And if I'm not mistaken, that tool handle we found in the shed, it once belonged to a lift mechanism, likely for a trapdoor. One not in the original toll house plans." Graves stared. "You think there's someone beneath the toll house?" "I think there may be something far more personal," she replied. "But what I know is this. Someone returned there, recently. Not to dig, but to—" Hyde Cornish looked up sharply. "You mean—" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Inspector, I suggest you open that hidden hatch, tonight, quietly. And if we find something, then you'll know the truth." Her voice was calm, but behind it lay steel. The moment of revelation was close, and St. Mary Mead, that pretty village of rose trellises and lace curtains, was about to confront what had long been buried beneath the soil. Beneath the lies, and beneath the toll house that had kept its secrets for far too long. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet shroud, soft and thick, clinging to chimney pots and garden paths in gentle folds. The air smelled of damp moss and lingering smoke from newly lit fireplaces, and the quiet was of a particular kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from expectation. At the toll house, the old structure stood stoic under the deepening blue. Once a stop for carriages and clerks, it now served as a historical curiosity, largely ignored save for annual open days and the occasional school outing. Its walls were mottled with ivy, and the brass plaque near the door, built 1792, restored 1950, had dulled to a flat patina. Few looked twice, which was precisely why it had remained so useful. Inspector Graves arrived just after 8, accompanied by Sergeant Cornish and 2 constables. The inspector's mood was one of reluctant cooperation. "This had better not be a wild goose chase," he muttered, stepping carefully onto the uneven flagstones of the toll house floor. "If we start digging up half the village on the word of a woman with an exceptional track record," Sergeant Cornish offered quietly, with a sideways glance. Graves didn't reply. The interior of the toll house was, as expected, dusty, faintly musty, and largely empty save for a few display boards and a glass case with rusted coins from the early 19th century. But Miss Marple had been specific. The lift mechanism would have required some kind of counterweight. She had said it wouldn't look like a door, but a stone slab, possibly flush with the wall, hidden in plain sight. The team spread out, tapping at walls, lifting floorboards, and testing the base of the fireplace. At first, there was nothing, just the creaks of old timber and the echo of movement within stone. Then, Constable Riggs called out, "Sir, back here," behind the display board. The slab, when uncovered, was exactly as Miss Marple had described. Square, weather-worn, and recessed into the wall just enough to be felt when pressed. No hinges, but a faint gap along one edge. and the telltale markings of something that had moved recently. It took both constables and a crowbar to lift it. Beneath was darkness. A small tunnel just large enough for a man to crawl through at a slight slope, flanked by crude stone steps carved into the earth. The air that rose from it was thick and cool. Graves stared at it, then at Cornish. "Get a torch, we're going down." The descent was short but claustrophobic, leading into a cramped cellar barely taller than a man's shoulder, and there, in the far corner, behind a wooden panel reinforced with wire, was a small iron chest and a folded wool coat. In the dim light, Graves approached. The chest was unlocked. Inside were letters, dozens of them wrapped in a thick rubber band, along with several financial ledgers and a battered green leather notebook. Trevelyan's. Cornish exhaled sharply. He hid it. "No," Graves said. "He brought it here." And then, the unmistakable rustle of fabric behind them. Graves turned. From the shadows near the tunnel's edge, a figure stepped forward. Henry Blackwell, his face pale, jaw tight, his hands trembling at his sides. "I didn't know anyone would come tonight," he said quietly. The silence that followed was electric. "You knew about this?" Graves demanded. I only came to make sure it was still here, that no one had taken it." "You helped build the slab," Cornish said, "didn't you?" Henry nodded slowly. "Years ago, when I worked for Mr. Bexley, I was just a boy apprenticing, fetching tools. I didn't understand then. But later, after the war, when Trevelyan showed up with those plans, asking questions, I remembered." Graves narrowed his eyes. "And Trevelyan?" Henry's voice broke slightly. "He wasn't going to keep it quiet. He said he'd found evidence of forged entries, of stolen funds, money that was meant for the Restoration Trust. He said he'd publish it, send it to the papers." Cornish's expression was grave. "And you tried to stop him?" Henry looked down. "He didn't listen. I followed him that morning to the toll house. He was going to photograph the documents and bring them to the solicitor in Eastbourne. I just meant to reason with him. But he pushed past me. Said he'd make sure the whole village knew." He looked up. He turned back once. "That's when I put." The silence deepened. "It wasn't meant to kill him," Henry said. "He hit his head. He was bleeding. I didn't know what to do, so I hid him in the chamber, behind the wall, and locked it." Cornish's voice was quiet. "Is he still there?" Henry nodded. Graves turned sharply. "Get the forensics team, and get him out." Henry didn't resist as the constables moved forward. He simply stood there, tears running down his face, as if the burden of a decade's silence had finally collapsed upon him. Hours later, as dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlour, the green notebook open before her. It had been returned to her by Graves. At her request, its contents deemed no longer necessary for prosecution. She read the last page. A note in Trevelyan's hand. "They think the past sleeps beneath their feet. But I've seen what was hidden, and I will not look away." She closed the notebook gently. There was justice now, and perhaps peace, but not without cost. In the end, the village would tell itself a neat story. A man who disappeared, a clerk who made a mistake, a scandal long buried, and a kindly old woman who had noticed a torn piece of paper and a misplaced blueprint. Miss Marple, for her part, asked for nothing, only that the roses be trimmed neatly that summer, and that the truth, once unearthed, be allowed to breathe. The village of St. Mary Mead had always excelled in returning to normalcy. It was, in some curious way, part of its very structure, as fixed and comforting as the steeple of St. Peter's or the ticking of the post office clock. Life resumed in quiet rhythms. Washing hung in gardens again. The church bells rang crisply on Sunday, and Miss Hartnell returned to her campaign against the overgrowth near the war memorial. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. It was not simply that a man had died tragically needlessly, or that another had been quietly taken away by the authorities. It was the manner of it. The revelation that the quiet, obliging Henry Blackwell had once been tied to something darker, something embedded in the very walls of the village. He had not been marched through the high street, nor held in the station overnight. Inspector Graves had arranged for his transfer early, just before sunrise, with little more than the clack of the constable's boots and the dull thump of the car door. Most villagers learned of his arrest by whispers and implications heard through hedges, relayed across tea counters, or confided in the low tones used when discussing things that did not suit polite company. And so, life resumed. The toll house was closed to the public for the remainder of the year, for restoration and review, according to a discreet sign posted on the gate. The local council voted to create a small commemorative fund for Mr. Hugh Trevelyan's family, though it was not entirely clear if any such family could be located. Long enough that buried secrets feel safe again. She let the silence hold, then leaned back in her chair. Would you be a dear and fetch another spoon? I believe Mrs. Clements lost hers to her saucer again. He stood a bit too quickly, knocked his napkin from his lap, and fumbled slightly as he crossed the rug. The tension in his spine was clear. The spoon was found, the teacup replaced, but Miss Marple had seen what she needed to see. Later that evening, in her parlour once more, she met with Sergeant Cornish and Inspector Graves. I don't yet have proof, she said calmly, but I believe Mr. Trevelyan had uncovered evidence of embezzlement, possibly something connected to the restoration fund for the toll house. Something that linked back not just to Lawrence Bexley, but to someone still here. Someone who benefited from keeping it quiet. Graves frowned. That's quite a claim. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then allow me to suggest something simpler. She pulled the thorn drawing from her basket and laid it on the table. This keystone here, it's not just symbolic. It marks an access point. And if I'm not mistaken, that tool handle we found in the shed, it once belonged to a lift mechanism, likely for a trapdoor. One not in the original toll house plans. Graves stared. You think there's someone beneath the toll house? I think there may be something far more personal, she replied. But what I know is this. Someone returned there, recently, not to dig, but to hide. Cornish looked up sharply. You mean? Miss Marple folded her hands. Inspector, I suggest you open that hidden hatch tonight, quietly, and if we find something, then you'll know the truth. Her voice was calm, but behind it lay steel. The moment of revelation was close. And St. Mary Mead, that pretty village of rose trellises and lace curtains, was about to confront what had long been buried beneath the soil. Beneath the lies, and beneath the toll house that had kept its secrets for far too long. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet shroud, soft and thick, clinging to chimney pots and garden paths in gentle folds. The air smelled of damp moss and lingering smoke from newly lit fireplaces, and the quiet was of a particular kind, the quiet that comes not from peace but from expectation. At the toll house, the old structure stood stoic under the deepening blue. Once a stop for carriages and clerks, it now served as a historical curiosity, largely ignored save for annual open days and the occasional school outing. Its walls were mottled with ivy, and the brass plaque near the door, built 1792, restored 1950, had dulled to a flat patina. Few looked twice, which was precisely why it had remained so useful. Inspector Graves arrived just after 8, accompanied by Sergeant Cornish and 2 constables. The inspector's mood was one of reluctant cooperation. "This had better not be a wild goose chase," he muttered, stepping carefully onto the uneven flagstones of the toll-house floor. "If we start digging up half the village on the word of a woman with an exceptional track record," Sergeant Cornish offered quietly, with a sideways glance. Graves didn't reply. The interior of the toll-house was as expected, dusty, faintly musty, and largely empty save for a few display boards and a glass case with rusted coins from the early 19th century. But Miss Marple had been specific. The lift mechanism would have required some kind of counterweight, she had said. It wouldn't look like a door, but a stone slab, possibly flush with the wall. Hidden in plain sight, the team spread out, tapping at walls, lifting floorboards, and testing the base of the fireplace. At first there was nothing, just the creaks of old timber and the echo of movement within stone. Then Constable Riggs called out, "Sir, back here, behind the display board." The slab, when uncovered, was exactly as Miss Marple had described, square, weather-worn, and recessed into the wall just enough to be felt when pressed. No hinges, but a faint gap along one edge, and a telltale markings of something that had moved recently. It took both constables and a crowbar to lift it. Beneath was darkness, a small tunnel just large enough for a man to crawl through to set. At a slight slope, flanked by crude stone steps carved into the earth, the air that rose from it was thick and cool. Graves stared at it, then at Cornish. "Get a torch, we're going down." The descent was short but claustrophobic, leading into a cramped cellar barely taller than a man's shoulder, and there, in the far corner, behind a wooden panel reinforced with wire, was a small iron chest and a folded wool coat. In the dim light, Graves approached. The chest was unlocked. Inside were letters, dozens of them wrapped in a thick rubber band, along with several financial ledgers and a battered, green leather notebook. Trevelyan's Cornish exhaled sharply. "He hid it." "No," Graves said. "He brought it here." And then, the unmistakable rustle of fabric behind them. Graves turned. From the shadows near the tunnel's edge, a figure stepped forward. Henry Blackwell, his face pale, jaw tight, his hands trembling at his sides. "I didn't know anyone would come tonight," he said quietly. The silence that followed was electric. "You knew about this?" Graves demanded. I only came to make sure it was still here, that no one had taken it." "You helped build the slab," Cornish said, "didn't you?" Henry nodded slowly. "Years ago, when I worked for Mr. Bexley, I was just a boy apprenticing, fetching tools. I didn't understand then. But later, after the war, when Trevelyan showed up with those plans, asking questions, I remembered." Graves narrowed his eyes. "And Trevelyan?" Henry's voice broke slightly. "He wasn't going to keep it quiet. He said he'd found evidence of forged entries, of stolen funds. Money that was meant for the Restoration Trust. He said he'd publish it, send it to the papers." Cornish's expression was grave. "And you tried to stop him?" Henry looked down. "He didn't listen. I followed him that morning to the toll house. He was going to photograph the documents and bring them to the solicitor in Eastbourne. I just meant to reason with him. But he pushed past me. Said he'd make sure the whole village knew. He looked up, he turned back once. That's when I pushed." The silence deepened. "It wasn't meant to kill him," Henry said. "He hit his head. He was bleeding. I didn't know what to do, so I hid him in the chamber, behind the wall, and locked it." Cornish's voice was quiet. "Is he still there?" Henry nodded. Graves turned sharply. "Get the forensics team." and get him out." Henry didn't resist as the constables moved forward. He simply stood there, tears running down his face, as if the burden of a decade's silence had finally collapsed upon him. Hours later, as dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlour, the green notebook open before her. It had been returned to her by Graves, at her request, its contents deemed no longer necessary for prosecution. She read the last page. A note in Trevelyan's hand. "They think the past sleeps beneath their feet. But I've seen what was hidden, and I will not look away." She closed the notebook gently. There was justice now, and perhaps peace. But not without cost. In the end, the village would tell itself a neat story. A man who disappeared, a clerk who made a mistake, a scandal long buried, and a kindly old woman who had noticed a torn piece of paper and a misplaced blueprint. Miss Marple, for her part, asked for nothing. Only that the roses be trimmed neatly that summer, and that the truth, once unearthed, be allowed to breathe. The village of St. Mary Mead had always excelled in returning to normalcy. It was, in some curious way, part of its very structure as fixed and comforting as the steeple of St. Peter's or the ticking of the post office clock. Life resumed in quiet rhythms. Washing hung in gardens again. The church bells rang crisply on Sunday, and Miss Hartnell returned to her campaign against the overgrowth near the war memorial. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. It was not simply that a man had died tragically, needlessly, or that another had been quietly taken away by the authorities. It was the manner of it. The revelation that the quiet, obliging Henry Blackwell had once been tied to something darker, something embedded in the very walls of the village. He had not been marched through the high street, nor held in the station overnight. Inspector Graves had arranged for his transfer early, just before sunrise, with little more than the clack of the constable's boots and the dull thump of the car door. Most villagers learned of his arrest by whispers and implications heard through hedges, relayed across tea counters, or confided in the low tones used when discussing things that did not suit polite company. And so, life resumed. The toll house was closed to the public for the remainder of the year, for restoration and review, according to a discreet sign posted on the gate. The local council voted to create a small commemorative fund for Mr. Hugh Trevelyan's family, though it was not entirely clear if any such family could be located. The truth of Trevelyan's identity had proven surprisingly ordinary in the end. A skilled architect, formerly employed in various towns across the south, drawn to St. Mary Mead, not by romance or whimsy, but by an old curiosity. He had stumbled, quite innocently, upon a series of records in a Brighton antiques shop records that led him back to Lawrence Bexley. And from there, to the toll house restoration, he had come searching for the truth, and he had found it. But the truth, Miss Marple knew better than most, was often unwelcome company in places where tradition and silence held sway. On a Wednesday morning, a week after the arrest, Miss Marple was invited to tea by Mrs. Bantry, who had taken it upon herself to restore spirits throughout the village. The cakes were sweet, the napkins starched, and the conversation carefully curated. "I do wish we could have known more about the man," Mrs. Bantry sighed, stirring her tea. "He seemed so elegant. Mysterious, of course, but not unpleasant. He was intelligent," Miss Marple said softly, "and principled, and perhaps a little naive. I suppose he thought the truth would set things right." "Sometimes it does," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes it only reveals what people wish to keep hidden." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "And that poor boy, Henry, well, it's difficult. So quiet, so ordinary." "Not so ordinary, as it turns out," Miss Marple said gently. But even then, his guilt was not born of malice. It was born of fear and shame, and perhaps the mistaken belief that the past, if buried deeply enough, would remain so. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Tell me truthfully, Jane, did you know?" "From the beginning," Miss Marple smiled. "I knew that something was wrong. That a man who disappears without his spectacles and his watch, who leaves a satchel behind on a muddy path but takes a torch into a shed, that is a man who never left at all." Mrs. Bantry exhaled, almost wistfully. "It's always the small things with you, isn't it?" "The smallest things are often the most revealing," Miss Marple said. "How a person reacts when asked an unexpected question, the way someone folds a paper, or how they pause when a name is mentioned." She sipped her tea. "The village pretends not to notice these things, but villages notice everything. It's only that most people don't understand what they've seen." Later that afternoon, as she walked home past the green, Miss Marple paused at the notice board outside. St. Peter's. The fate photographs had been posted, rows of smiling faces beneath strings of bunting, children with jam-smeared mouths, and a picture of the garden display Trevelyan had submitted. She looked at the tag again. "Where memory sleeps, secrets grow in silence." He had tried to tell them, she thought, in his own way, quiet and coded. But few had been ready to hear. She turned from the board and made her way along Church Lane, where the late summer sun filtered softly through the trees. Her footsteps were light, her posture composed, but her mind as always was reflecting. In the end, it had not been a grand conspiracy or a violent cover-up. It had been something far more human, a quiet crime, an act of desperation. A secret passed between generations like a ticking clock. Henry Blackwell had buried more than a man. He had buried his own shame, his knowledge of a stolen inheritance meant for community betterment. Trevelyan had uncovered it, not out of malice but duty. And, in a moment of panic, a push had ended a life. The irony, Miss Marple thought, was that had the truth been faced openly years ago, nothing more than reputations would have been lost. But fear, like ivy, tends to climb in silence until the structure underneath begins to rot. That evening, as she returned to her cottage and drew the curtains against the cooling air, Miss Marple paused by her writing desk. She took the green notebook and placed it gently into a drawer, beside old letters, clippings, and other quiet pieces of the past. It no longer needed to be examined. It had served its purpose. Outside, the village exhaled. The butcher's bell rang cheerily. The baker set out a tray of new loaves, and in the vicarage garden, children once again ran between the hedges, laughing as though no shadow had ever touched the place. But Miss Marple, in her heart, knew better. Shadows do not disappear, they simply shift. And every village, matter how quaint, is full of places where memory sleeps, until someone asks the right question and wakes it.